United States Navy, Sea, Air, and Land Teams, or U.S. Navy SEALs. No single combat unit captures the imagination for us here at home in America, and indeed for people across the world. The U.S. Navy SEALs have long exemplified excellence in battle, valor, and courage. They are upheld as the best of us. And for 2 long and grueling decades, they have often been tasked with some of the most dangerous raids in U.S. military history, including, most famously, the assault that led to the death of Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda at the time of the September 11th attacks. And it is against the backdrop of this heroism that the story and alleged crimes of Edward R. Gallagher in Iraq cast a pall over the elite SEAL Trident. Accused of murdering a prisoner of war in cold blood during the battle to retake Mosul, Eddie Gallagher's trial would divide the close-knit SEAL community and raise important questions about the ability of our soldiers to report misconduct to their chain of command, would capture the attention of an American president and lead to the firing of U.S. Navy Secretary Richard Spencer, and force the Pentagon to review how the department educates and trains our service members about wartime ethics and the laws of armed conflict, and how we monitor, investigate, report, and adjudicate our adherence to them. This thrilling saga has been turned into The Line, a must-watch 4-part documentary series exclusively available on Apple TV+, directed by Peabody and Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Doug Shultz. And here on The Ask, my co-host Cliff W. Gilmore and myself, Weiss Azimi, have had the privilege to speak to Doug about his work on this important series. Let us now listen to the theatrical trailer and then meet our guest.
In the SEAL teams, there's no training of how to report your chief for war crimes. There's no way that I could live with myself had I not gone forward and said what I saw.
I'm willing to put my life in danger to get the job done.
It came over the radio, there was a wounded prisoner. Eddie said, "Nobody touch him, he's all mine."
Did you actually see it happen?
Yeah, I saw it happen. This is the most disgraceful day I've ever seen in my life.
I thought I was going to be in trouble just for being there.
Did you ever intentionally shoot any unarmed civilian?
No.
Did you ever try to kill an unarmed teenage boy?
No.
Do you remember ever shooting a little girl?
No.
It's a very rare occurrence that SEALs are going against one of their own.
There is a huge mistake going on here.
Everyone was covering their tail from the top down.
The debate wasn't, did Eddie kill a prisoner? The debate was, Eddie killed a prisoner, but is that okay?
They have no evidence, no proof.
Every man, woman, and child that came into his line of sight, he tried to kill him.
No, that didn't happen. You're making it up. I hate Eddie, but what you're doing is lying.
I should not be on trial for murder. It is war.
I don't think they were prepared for this giant bombshell in the courtroom.
I'm innocent. I love you.
Hi, sweetheart.
There's a line in the sand now. Unfortunately, the truth is not perfect.
Doug, I'd like to welcome you to The Ask. We're here to discuss your work on The Line, an Apple Plus TV series that runs 4 episodes in length about the trial of U.S. Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher and the involvement of his platoon, Team 7, Alpha Platoon, U.S. Navy SEALs. I'm your host, Weiss Azimi, and I'm being joined today by my co-host, Cliff W. Gilmore. And first question goes over to Cliff.
Doug, thanks first and foremost for just giving us your time. Time's one of the most precious things we have, and it's finite, and we never know how finite. So every time we're parceling it out, it's a gift. I've looked over your filmography, CIA Confidential, Shadow Ops. You've done some really, really cool work in some areas similar to The Line. And I'm curious, just sort of as a soft opener to get our voices warmed up and all that, talk to us about what made you choose this topic, Eddie Gallagher, that trial, that case, and what drew you in to making that a project?
That's a good question. I think, those other projects, I have in the past done some projects outlining stories about espionage during the Cold War and CIA actions after 9/11. Not really investigative, more just kind of sort of reporting on the events that led to the capture of certain people who were involved with these attacks. This one, actually, Jigsaw Productions, which is Alex Gibney's company, they called me. They had this project getting ready to start up. And it's actually two projects. There's a podcast and a doc series. And the podcast team, which is hosted by Dan Tversky, they had started already, I think about 5 months before the doc series ramped up. So they had made a lot of inroads in research and things like that. And we shared resources with them. But in the beginning, it was not obvious to me why we were making this film. I thought I like a lot of people, I think I thought I knew the story. I thought he was this Navy SEAL who did something bad, was convicted, and was pardoned by Trump. That's what I thought I knew, which is actually incorrect. But then you've got some articles, the more I read about it, it seemed like there were a lot of interesting angles to explore. And the story definitely turned out to be something different from what I thought it was. And also there was the challenge of trying to get to these guys whose job is to be invisible and to hear from them directly. And clearly, as you can see from those shows in my past, you mentioned, I do for some reason have an interest in military activity overseas. Maybe I'm from a military family myself, so maybe that's what it is. I don't know. But once I really understood how complicated the story was, it was kind of a no-brainer.
It definitely was not straightforward.
Yeah.
That becomes obvious. And you did an excellent job in the 4 episodes of showing the complexity of that and not simplifying it, like making it black and white, but breaking it out in a digestible way that could make folks see just how complex it was, that it wasn't as simple as yes, no, right, wrong by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. Thank you, Cliff. Your Apple Plus TV series runs 4 episodes in length. And I'm really curious, could you please share with us how you went about breaking apart the story across these 4 one-hour episodes for our listeners?
Sure. In the beginning, I remember thinking, 4 hours is a lot of time. Is that too much time for this story? And then as we went on, we started thinking, can we get 5 hours? Because there were so many avenues to go down, and just based on the material we ended up getting. And so, if for people who haven't seen it, basically the first 2 halves of the series, you're on deployment with these guys. And we were so fortunate to get actual footage shot by these SEALs on the deployment, which is something that you just never get to see. So being in that deployment is not only amazing just from a filmmaking standpoint, but just to be able to experience what these guys are describing and how these, they always talk about these bonds of brotherhood that are forged when you're on deployment together, especially in a deployment area like Mosul, which was where all of the action was, a combat deployment. And so to get to see it and experience it as a viewer, you start to sort of understand and see how these bonds come together. And then the second half of the series, obviously, is when they come back and those bonds are tested by the investigation, the trial, and all the aftermath. So figuring out how to lay all that out was a challenge at first. And, so what we ended up doing is basically spending the first hour meeting the characters and just being on deployment with them. And when they came back, on paper, this was a very successful deployment. Alpha Platoon was sent over there to support the Iraqi Special Forces, the ERD, in clearing ISIS out of Mosul. And they did that in a shorter period of time than expected. And then they all came back alive. So on paper, it was a very successful deployment. And that's pretty much what you experienced in the first episode. And then obviously, when the guys came forward, they report that there's a whole other perspective on this deployment. And that's what you experience in the second one. And then the third and fourth episodes obviously follow the lead up of the investigation and the trial.
The breakout into the acts, if you will, very well done in terms of that laying out. You see almost sort of that class. It's almost like a Shakespearean breakout here. Let's set it up and then let's come to here. And again, that was part of, from my perspective, a masterful telling of the tale to take such a complex thing and put it together in a way that lays those details out and lets people build on it as they go, but still maintains a bit of a lot of that documentarian neutrality of laying it out and letting folks absorb it. You hit on something there that just, it's not deep thought, but as a former public affairs guy, I was fascinated by the quality and the volume of the footage that you were able to get. And you touched on it there. You suggested some of it came from, perhaps most of it came from the team themselves. And I suspected, because I know as a public affairs person in the Marine Corps, it was like pulling teeth to get permission to release that kind of thing to the general public. I was hyper transparent. Like, let's just get this out there. Did you have good cooperation from DOD? Were you able to get any footage from them. Like,
No.
surprise. And there too, then how presumably there may be some specific sources you wouldn't want to name or cite. And certainly there's anonymity in the journalistic side of things when it comes to that. But how did you pop that cork, if you will, to get access to that stuff? Is that about relationships? Is it about contact?
That footage came from a lot of different sources, and we just sort of accumulated it over time. There was some of it in the evidence files because some of these guys have government issued helmet cams. Some of them had their own. Some guys like to shoot more, some guys don't. And so it was kind of scattered in different places. We just kind of slowly managed to, as we connected with more people, piece together more and more footage. And there was a central laptop basically where all these guys would upload their footage and share it. So eventually we knew that that was kind of the holy grail, like getting to that source of all the platoon footage. And eventually I think we pieced together most of it.
There's certainly a treasure trove of that out there. And as the environment evolved, it was called in the services, we referred to it as the information environment or the communication environment, and how fast that moved. I mean, we took watching policy evolve from the beginnings of the global war on terror, where everyone was just running around with all their own gear, to finally putting policies in like, no, you can't have your own devices. If for no other reason, then it will geotag. And so we'd have young Marines sending pictures home. Hey, this is where we're sleeping tonight. Like, hey, kid, that's geotag. Just fascinating that you were able to pop the cork there. Like say, use that language again and find that access. So much of it out there. And
I mean, we were, just to be clear, we didn't have permission to use this from DoD or anything, but we did run it through security clearance. We knew that there was material in this footage that could be considered a security breach, and we definitely didn't want to do that. So we had people go through it because they're on screens and there's technology that is not public. So we were very careful to make sure that we weren't exposing anything we weren't supposed to.
And having worked in that area, despite my own hyper transparency approach to public affairs in the service, also always balanced against privacy and security. And I really appreciate the professionalism of taking that into account there. There can be folks who find that treasure trove and are just like, yay, I found it. And then others like yourselves who really do the due diligence there that's so essential to tell the story at the same time that you're making sure folks are reasonably well protected as you go.
I do want to sort of follow up with a question here that Cliff sort of kicked off for us, which is your access. And I think that's one of the defining things about the line. What made it such a compelling experience was the access that you achieved with you and your team. You had incredible archival, as we discussed. You also had incredible access to both sides of this story. You had great access to platoon mates like Dylan and Josh on the side of the accusers. And you also had evidently incredible access to Eddie, Andrea, and Eddie's brother. What was the process like for you and your team building trust and access with both parties in this story?
Yeah, this was a team event, really. As I mentioned, the podcast team had started about 5 months or so before we did. And they had gone down, I think right before lockdown started, they had gone down to Florida and done an interview with Eddie and Andrea for the podcast. And the podcast scope, if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it because the two projects really work well together. For that project, they interviewed, I think, over 50 former Navy SEALs about all kinds of issues related to this, but not directly involved with only the Gallagher case. They talk about things like moral injury and the act of violence and the effect that the multiple deployments has on you and the effect of separating from the SEAL teams. It's really, really fascinating. And then the Gallagher story is woven in between. So we had a great team of researchers and journalists on that team that we shared as a resource for the doc series as well. And because they had already done this interview with Eddie and Andrea, it wasn't totally new to the Gallaghers, but it was sort of a reset. This is what we're doing. And they were, I think, as anyone should be, rightfully skeptical about what our objective was and how we were going to present this. But then once they made the decision to do it, they were all in. I mean, they basically said, we have nothing to hide. And this was production during COVID. So it was really tough to, we had to use local crew. I traveled down to Florida and, it's when you're shooting, anyone in production has had to deal with these production protocols where you have to have masks and all of this stuff. And then we were in Florida where basically nobody was acting as though COVID is a thing. So it was an interesting process, but basically Eddie was the first interview that we did. And we talked to him for, I think, a day and a half, and then Andrea, and then we interviewed Sean and Tim Parlatore, their lawyer. So our entry to the story was from the Gallagher point of view, which was an interesting way to start. And it was also basically the only way we could do it, because at that point we had no contact with any of the SEALs who were accusers or on the platoon. So that's what we were trying to figure out. How do we do that? We were working with the Gallaghers, and I have to say they were very generous with their time. And people keep asking me why he would have participated in this. And I think basically he had been acquitted, so felt like he had nothing to lose. He also was writing a book, which is out now. And I think, they have a story they want to tell, and they weren't afraid to do it. Now, with the other side, those guys, the accusers in particular, they came forward to launch this investigation. They were told that their identities would be kept protected, which they were not. They ended up being leaked. They did not get a conviction, and they took a lot of heat from the SEAL community and the Fox News community. Several of them retired from the Navy and moved across the country, moved to different places. I mean, they really took a lot. They risked a lot for very little payoff. And so to convince those guys that it would be worth putting themselves out there publicly again seemed like a real long shot. So it took a lot of time and a lot of conversations. And I think in the end, it was not really about convincing them to do something they didn't want to do. I think we hit it at just the right time. A little over a year had passed since the trial. The fallout had settled, and they knew that Eddie was writing a book. I think everybody just wanted it to go away, but it wasn't going away. And I think the Gallaghers also continued to post things about these guys. They put their faces on social media and called them jokers and cowards. And I think that really, really bugged them. And because of the gag order and because of the Navy's policy of not addressing these things, their voices had never been heard. So you knew that they really wanted to interrupt this steady flow of this narrative that was coming from the Gallagher side. And that's all to say, I think it was more just making the case that we were the right people on the right platform for them to tell the story, because they really just wanted to do it once and have that be that. So eventually, after many conversations and meetings, they decided to go all in.
One of the consistent themes that came up in the series, particularly from the accusers, was their attempt to repeatedly go up the chain of command, to let the chain of command know about the misconduct that they observed or wanted to report on regarding Eddie Gallagher, and the problems that they ran into in attempting that. And within Mosul itself, their direct reports were one, Eddie Gallagher as the chief, and then above him, Lieutenant Jake Portier as the officer in command, who, as you sort of present within the series, had a very unusual connection to Eddie as a former student of his in the BUDS program. So you have that, and then you, of course, have them coming back from Iraq and once again trying to raise attention to this issue. And what I found fascinating, and I'd like to hear, your perspective on this, is how ultimately in the aftermath of the trial of Eddie Gallagher for what he was accused of, there was an attempt to review the conduct of the officers in the sort of immediate chain of reporting command involved in this incident. And all of them ended up being absolved of responsibility for what they may or may not have done based on what they were hearing from Team 7. Could you talk to us about the importance of this issue and this theme within the series about the inability to find the right channel to report misconduct within the U.S. military?
Sure. I mean, that's really the crux of the whole thing. So one of the sort of pillars of the Gallagher defense is that these guys never said anything about war crimes until they came back. And they say that they were at first just complaining that Eddie had been stealing candy bars from their care packages and things like that. And then according to the Gallagher defense, these guys weren't getting a response based on those accusations. So finally, they came up with a low act violation, which is a law of armed conflict violation report, meaning they just suddenly conspired to say Eddie stabbed a prisoner and was shooting civilians. So from the accuser's point of view, that's not what happened at all. And they say that while on deployment, they did try to report this up. And as you said, the problem there is that the person they would normally report to would be Eddie because he's their chief, right? And then if you go above Eddie, you're going to Jake Portier, who's the officer in charge. And Jake was actually a student of Eddie's at Bud's. So he had a relationship with Eddie, where basically he would let Eddie run the show. That's according to everybody on the platoon. And I don't know if that's totally unusual all the time. I think quite often the officer will let the chief make the calls when it comes to the tactical arrangements. But in this case, it seemed to be sort of extreme in that the guys would joke that, Jake was Eddie's abused wife, or, because he would just let Eddie yell and run the show and never seemed to put his foot down. So anyway, they say that they had reported things to Jake Portier and nothing happened. And this happened repeatedly as things worsened over the course of that deployment. And by the time they left, which I think was early September of 2017, the environment had become so toxic that they, I think, all felt like we just need to wait until we get back to San Diego and then we'll take this up the chain. And then even in San Diego, you go up to there's a lieutenant commander named Robert Breisch, and then another master chief, Brian Alazawi. And it's very unclear at what point they remember hearing these charges. The stories don't quite align, but it seems that there were repeated attempts by these guys to report, and they were constantly pushed down. And, Eddie did have a great reputation, and he had, I think, the backing of these guys who did not want to see another scandal erupt in the Navy, and also had a hard time, I think, believing that this guy who on paper had 8 deployments under his belt, was known as a superstar, and suddenly they're seeing reports that he was shooting civilians and stabbed a prisoner. They didn't want anything to do with it. So it took a lot of persistence from these guys, and basically threatening, I think, to go to Fox News before they launched an investigation.
I think it's so interesting. And in fact, one of your interviewees sort of brings up one reason why the platoon faced such an issue reporting this to their direct reports, as you laid out. Gio, I think, at one point in your series says that it was almost like a generational gap or conflict between Eddie and the rest of the platoon. Here is this 9/11 conflict era guy set up against these people who have more of an academic understanding of what 9/11 was and the launch of the war on terror. And so I wonder if that sort of played a part in the calculus of these officers hearing these complaints from the rest of the platoon and saying, what are we going to do with these guys? They don't get it, which was, I think, thought-provoking in your documentary. I'd also add here that this wasn't the first time that Eddie was reported for possible misconduct, and he was alleged to have shot an Afghan girl in the mid-2010s. So there was a precedence for him trying to shoot women and children, apparently, which is very grim and dark.
So there's 2 things there. One is, you mentioned that this idea of a generational divide between these guys, and there was maybe about a 10-year age difference between Eddie and most of these guys. But again, that is one of the central parts of the Gallagher defense, is that this generational gap, meaning that these younger SEALs just wanted to sit around and play video games, and they didn't like that he was making them work hard. That's really a central part of their defense. But if you go through and look at their training evaluations from workup and evaluations that Eddie himself had to sign off on, that's not the case at all. They all received great evaluations, are recommended for promotion. And even on deployment, a lot of these central accusers are not the young guys. They're the E6s. So they're kind of the senior guys on the team. And Eddie assembled this team himself. So to make that claim now just doesn't seem to really hold up, according to everybody else who was there. But on the other point, which is the alleged shooting in Afghanistan and stories like that, this, I think, comes from a culture that all of these guys describe of just kind of braggadocio, and Eddie was one of these guys who loved to tell stories about badass things he had done, fights he'd gotten into. And there was a story where that he told several times, and it seems in different ways, because everybody told the story in a different way, where he was on deployment in Afghanistan, and there was a guy who was a Taliban leader, I guess, and that he was holding a little girl. And in one case, he told someone that he shot through the little girl to kill the old man. And then when people asked him about it, he said, oh, you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet, something like that. And this story sort of mutated, in one case, he didn't shoot the girl, but he shot the guy. And it just came as part of these stories that he would tell. And what happened is when these guys got on deployment, they had just come from I think maybe a 6-month workup, maybe longer. So they'd been working together as a team, getting ready for this deployment. They were all excited. Eddie had the best reputation and was a buds instructor for a lot of these guys. And they really idolized him because he was physical, he was fast and strong, and he was going to get them into the spot where they were going to see the most action, which is what they all wanted. And then when this stabbing incident happened, alleged stabbing, I think then they all started to wonder, like, oh, are these crazy stories that he's telling actually true? Because they had just sort of blown them all off, like, he's just bragging about having killed 200 guys or whatever. And so that, I think, really set the tone for the rest of that deployment, where they were suddenly realized, like, okay, maybe some of these stories are true. That's the way it's been described to me. So I don't know what the reality is behind those stories from Afghanistan, but it wasn't just other people telling them. These are sort of stories that Eddie would tell.
Right. So it kind of sets a pattern that now you kind of go back and look at and say, well, what really happened there?
Jumping around a bit here as we go through, and I have not done the Shakespearean narrative arc, but Wise and I kind of talked through like different areas of interest as we go into this. And one of mine, still through very much that lens of having been the interface between the military and the public, has to do with that evolution of social media. And as we watch through this, Andrea Gallagher, Eddie Gallagher's wife, played, arguably an outsized role running in parallel, able to say things that he couldn't because he was ongoing through the trial. Certainly she was able to say things that as a public affairs officer, I would have essentially been constrained. And I think there was a mention in it at some point that was like fighting Mike Tyson with your hands tied behind your back. My pat answer, and not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because it was the mission, would be, in a case like this, would be something along the lines of, well, in the interest of protecting the rights to a fair and open trial for the suspect or the accused, it would be inappropriate for me to provide such and such detail right now. And then I go turn the TV on and there's the defense attorney saying whatever he wants or whatnot. And then in the social media world, anybody now can do that. I was talking with Wise a little earlier about you had your editors and newspapers, finite space. You've got to get into that space. Now anyone can send it out, as Andrea Gallagher did, into the world, where then it can get picked up and be slotted into some of that traditional space. Getting to a question in here, as you were building this story, gathering this information together, pulling the documentary into that narrative arc, what was your take on Andrea Gallagher and the role she played and how that influenced the overall process of justice itself in this case?
I think Eddie Gallagher would still be in jail if it weren't for Andrea Gallagher. She was a master at two things: basically creating a brand for Eddie as a hero who was being wronged by the very Navy that he had served, and at branding the accusers as cowards or sort of slackers who couldn't handle the pressure that Eddie had put on them. That was really the basis of their defense. And she was very effective at using social media to keep this message going, at fundraising. And she and Eddie's brother, Sean, who is a lobbyist and also and pretty well connected, I think, on Capitol Hill. Really nice guy, likable guy. He was doing his part as well. So the two of them really formed this kind of super team. And they had a strategy, and that strategy was to get to Donald Trump. And they knew that the way to do that was to go on Fox News, which they did. And immediately Trump picked this up as one of his causes, and he intervened several times in the case. So they were very, very good at that. And on the flip side of that, the guys who were accusing Eddie were essentially under a gag order. So they couldn't talk about the case. Right. And the Navy's policy is not to comment on the case as well. And so in the age of social media, that was just a disaster for the Navy. And the more that they bungled the case a bit, and by them, I mean NCIS and the Navy investigators, the more they added credibility to Andrea's case that the Navy was doing this to her husband. So it was the social media, and the use of the media was an essential part of this story and how they successfully pulled this off.
As objectively as I can definitely see the genius of the strategy. And if I were to just, lay it out, say, hey, here's the goal. Let's get him. Let's protect Eddie Gallagher. They went about it, as you said, just a masterful approach to it. It's interesting to me as well that, you raise the issue of framing the accusers as cowards, that at the same time, I could say that that's absolute genius strategy. Currently being in a whistleblower protection suit, I've been on the receiving end of that side of the strategy, and also then watch like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's genius. That's what you have to say about me. And I can only imagine how difficult it would have been with that, the constraints of what could be said by the witnesses as the investigation was going on. Because again, the public affairs side of it is to protect the sanctity of the system, if you will, and allow the accused to be protected as best as possible to get a fair investigation, ultimately a fair trial. That it is just reasonable policy, in my opinion, that really very little can be said from the government side. It's a mess. 20 years I was in the Corps doing public affairs. It was constantly running up to that. Again, Mike Tyson with your hands behind your back.
I will add here that quote actually comes from a former Secretary of the Navy, no less, which, just goes to show how formidable Andrea's campaign was, at least from the perspective of the Navy while this case was underway. Going back to the outcome of the trial itself, and I find this so incredibly interesting within your series, is the appearance of a very curious figure named Brian Ferguson. He kind of blows into this story from out of nowhere with the prosecution and the defense, and very aggressively approaches everyone within Team 7 Alpha Platoon and urges them to be represented by him in the trial, even going so far as to laying out what would happen to them if he didn't represent them. He said, your lives will be ruined. Eddie will be a superstar. You'll be left out in the cold wondering what you did with your life. So please let me represent you and help you through this. And Chris Sasplak, the chief prosecutor who originally was on this case, one of the best prosecutors within the U.S. Navy on the West Coast, at one point in your series says he found it highly unusual that this man was securing these immunity deals for these witnesses. And it had enormous consequences on the outcome of the trial. Could you please share with us just who Brian Ferguson was and how he fit it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try. He's a very mysterious character, and his motivation for doing this is not exactly clear. But Brian he's a lawyer, but he likes to say that he's not a lawyer, and he represents these guys pro bono. And so he showed up very early on and started to reach out to all of these witnesses. And I think he more or less just started to scare them and say, like, hey, you could be in danger of being prosecuted. Eddie's gonna get a book deal. He's gonna get a movie. He's gonna walk. But you could be extradited to Iraq and tried for war crimes there. You're going to end up in prison here. And a lot of these guys, things happen on deployment, simple things from drinking beer, which you could get in trouble for or get busted down in rank. I think a lot of these guys had done that. And it could range to other things, maybe a bad shot, or, there was an incident where part of the platoon was investigated over the deployment of a switchblade, which killed a few civilians, and it was investigated, and in the end, it was deemed an accident. But those kinds of things, if you're associated with those things, you're nervous that, oh, I'm going to be, am I really at risk of being prosecuted, especially if you have no experience in the criminal justice system. So anyway, I think Brian really used that to his advantage to snap these guys up, get them immunity deals, and how closely he worked with Tim Parlatore and the defense team, it's really unclear. There's definitely some ethical lines that seem like they were being crossed. And I think it's confusing because in the end, what happened is you had this one lawyer representing witnesses that were being called for the prosecution and for the defense. So what ended up happening, not aside from the trial, is just that it created this schism between the guys on the platoon, and guys who once were really loud and vocal about wanting to push this investigation through, sat down with NCIS and detailed all of these really damning charges against Eddie, all of a sudden wanted to drop it, let it go. And that caused a lot of friction between these guys and a lot of suspicion about what people's motivations were. And in the end, it ended up being just a handful of guys who still wanted to continue with the investigation. And then at the trial, you had these guys who I think Brian Ferguson ended up representing about 14 of these guys. And the guys who were represented by Ferguson, their stories started to change a little bit, just in that they held back on details that they were very forthcoming with during their NCIS interviews, and they would add in little bits of details that just kind of took the focus off of Eddie slightly, or just made it seem like maybe Eddie didn't do what they had said before. And I think that really threw everyone off. And obviously the big one is Corey Scott, who was one of the witnesses to the alleged stabbing. He turned the entire trial on its head when he testified, suddenly saying that he's the one who held his thumb over the breathing tube and suffocated this ISIS fighter. And so after that, prosecutors didn't want to call any of the other witnesses who were represented by Ferguson because they had no idea what they were going to say. And one of those guys was Ivan Villanueva, who was another witness to the alleged stabbing. So it really just threw the trial for a loop, but also the investigation, because as soon as people signed up with Brian Ferguson, they stopped talking, and they called it Fergusoning. They stopped cooperating with the investigation, basically. So he had an outsized influence on this trial. And I will tell you that after Eddie said that after the verdict, he and Brian Ferguson and Ivan Villanueva and Corey Scott went out for a beer to celebrate. So that's two guys who had accused him of stabbing a prisoner going out to celebrate his not guilty verdict with him. So
David Phillips, a great New York Times reporter who is following this case alongside the production of your documentary, has this great quote within your series saying that, usually it's never really granted. He traces back the issue to classic mob cases where these mafia groups are on trial for their respective crimes. One of the made men will come forward and say, I'll talk as long as you give me immunity. And then he owns up to absolutely everything during the trial and walks away scot-free, which is why it's not handed out so readily, considering that it could be so potentially destructive to a criminal proceeding. Thank you for that additional insight. And going back to your point about possible coordination, I think it was the Trump lawyer. What was his name?
Mark Mukasey.
Mark Mukasey, who says they had no idea what Corey Scott would say, but they knew what to ask him.
If you listen to that recording from the trial, it's, they like to present this as a spontaneous admission on the stand. But if you listen to it, it's perfectly rehearsed. And also, one of the interesting things is that this didn't make it into this series, but the forensic investigator that we talked to, Ron Martinelli, he talks about how they had, before the trial, they did a mock trial with the jury and everything. And Gallagher was unanimously voted guilty. And at that time, they had Corey Scott and Craig Miller, who was another witness to this alleged stabbing, walk through exactly what happened. And they both did exactly the same thing. And so for this to then suddenly happen on the stand in the way that it unfolded, that's the kind of thing where if you're given immunity, you would just you're given the immunity deal and you give this information over when you're talking to the authorities who are giving you the immunity. You don't normally save that for a big showpiece on the witness stand unless the aim is to throw the whole proceedings for a loop. And that's exactly what happened. So it was a very effective tactic. I was going to say show, but I think it was more, an effective tactic. And again, the why behind it is just unresolved. I don't think anybody really knows why Corey Scott did that, but all our efforts to talk to him were unsuccessful.
Yeah, a fascinating and important figure in your series that is talked about frequently throughout all your episodes. One thread that runs through the line is this sort of philosophical debate between the two camps regarding what is just in a war. And Eddie Gallagher is obviously on one side of the spectrum, and his fellow Navy SEALs, Dylan Dilley and Josh Rhines, on another. And we touched upon this a little bit earlier in our interview here, but could you talk to us about the importance of this running debate throughout your series about what is permissible or what is just in an actual war setting?
Yeah, I don't think I can say what's just in a war setting, but I can talk about the perspective that I got from these guys. And you're right. One of the things about the case and the way that it played out in the media is that it really highlights the split in, between these 2 points of view. One is you just go over there, the ends justifies the means, you do what's necessary, and then you come home. And the other one takes a more complicated view of things that, there are rules of engagement we have to abide by for many reasons. And it's hard, when you are in that environment. I think one of the things that's toughest for me to imagine is the context in which all of this happened, right? So They're in Mosul, where what they describe is that there are bodies on the ground all the time, everywhere. So you're just used to seeing death at any given moment. It's a combat deployment. So, these guys were not on the front lines, so they're not getting bombarded constantly, but they're definitely in danger. And they're up there, the snipers in particular, Dylan and Josh, they're up there tasked with sorting out who's good and bad and picking off good targets and making sure they don't shoot bad targets, right? And so when you are in that kind of environment, then you have a situation like the other important thing I wanted to add here is that as they talk about it in the series, for a while, they're housed right next to the Iraqi Emergency Response Division. And that, at the time, we were supposedly distancing ourselves from the Iraqi ERD because they had been documented committing war crimes, torturing prisoners. And this was actually happening right next door to Alpha Platoon. And they could hear it at night, all night, for quite a while. In fact, there was a hole in the wall where one of the ISIS prisoners on the ERD side defecated on a plate and threw it through a hole, and it landed on one of the SEALs' beds in this room. So they were right next to where this was happening, and they describe all kinds of horrible sounds overnight. So it's very hard to imagine being one of these guys living in those conditions, hearing this at night, pretending we're not hearing it, gunshots, rapes, dogs barking, and then going out and trying to maintain your ethical compass when you're at work. So that's the environment this is happening in. So to maintain your sense of right and wrong during that time seems like something that would take an effort. And so then when you're in a situation with this prisoner, this ISIS prisoner, when he is brought in and your chief, as they describe, decides that we're going to either experiment on this guy, do procedures on him until he dies, or stab him, it is easy for me to imagine that you'd be questioning, like, is this wrong? Is something going wrong here? Or is this okay? Does it matter? This is an ISIS fighter. It's hard to imagine being one of those guys and then having the wherewithal to say, you know what, this is against the Geneva Conventions. Like, this is wrong. I need to report this up. Especially when you're in a community where loyalty is considered one of the most important attributes, and that you just don't rat on your fellow teammates. So I seem to have gone way off the deep end, but that's the context is, I think, important, because it's not like you're here in your civilian life and you see something wrong and you can point it out. Like, when you're in an environment like that and you're surrounded by death all the time, it seems like it takes even more conviction to recognize where the line is and that it's been crossed.
You're right on the complexity of all that, Doug, and you're articulating the stresses of being in that combat environment. And this truth of the matter is, even back at home in a civilian environment, whether you're looking at it through the academic lens or a personal experience lens or whatever, that even in a non-combat environment, when you run into hostility, when you run into toxicity, when you run into some of those factors you talked about, like, the bondings and reputation and power and position and authority, even then, when you see a thing, it can be incredibly difficult to sort it out and to recognize it. And then you talked earlier about, some of them waiting till after the deployment, choosing to wait till after the deployment. That's actually fairly common, even in the civilian sector side of things, of getting distance before you get clarity and are willing to take a stand, which then creates that, like, oh, now you've got a problem. Like, well, no, the pattern of it was happening, but because you're in it, you can't see it sometimes. You hit on a point there, medical experiments, as the phrase was in. There's a point in the series where you're talking with Eddie Gallagher, and if I recall correctly, he essentially said, yes, I did these things. What was it like being in the room at that time? And what are your thoughts to what seems to be an admission of at least a couple of activities that, as he described them, at least certainly seem like potential violations?
I'll add here that I'm very pleased that you had Richard Spencer respond directly to that, the former Secretary of Navy, because it hits you like a hammer.
Yeah, I'm pleased too, because we could not get anyone from the Navy to be a voice for this. It was really important to get the Navy to weigh in, because they hadn't, and we know that they didn't want, we reached out to them many times, they didn't want anything to do with it. And to have Richard Spencer come in as an authoritative voice for the Navy was very important to us, so I was grateful for that. But yeah, so the end of the series, so that interview was done, I'd say maybe 10 months after the first one. So it was after we had eventually talked to all of the other guys and gone through a lot of new evidence, because as I said, Eddie was the first interview that we did. So at that time, we didn't even have, I don't think I even had a full trial transcript at that time. So it was just a sort of accumulation of evidence. So we went back and so that he could address all of the things that we had learned. And I think by that time, his demeanor was slightly different, just in that it seemed he was less nervous about us, but seemed more willing to. The story had changed a little bit, and what he was saying was that all of those guys were in on it, and that they were basically using this prisoner as a guinea pig to practice medical procedures. And when you look at the photos, there are a lot of them of this scene with this ISIS fighter on the ground and all this medical detritus everywhere. Start to wonder exactly what was going on. What were they doing? Because when this guy was brought in, he had a leg wound and he was in a very soft voice, seemed like he was having trouble breathing, which they attribute to possibly having blast lung because he had been in a building that suffered an airstrike. But then there are tubes coming out of his chest and out the side of him, and there's a bandage on his neck that wasn't there initially. And so the question is, what were you doing to him and who was there? And there was Corey Scott, who's a medic, T.C. Byrne, who's a medic, but he left apparently during the time when this prisoner died, Ivan Villanueva, who was one of the witnesses to the alleged stabbing, and then Eddie, who was also a medic, but according to the platoon, had never actually treated anybody while they were there until this prisoner. So this sort of newish twist on his story was that all of these guys that were there were just using this as a lab practice, basically, with the intention of killing him. And I don't know, he said that was never verbalized. So we can't say that these guys were in on it. They were going along with what their chief was doing. And who did what, I don't know. I do know that Eddie wasn't the only one doing these procedures on this guy, and that one of them was not a medic. He wanted to be, but he wasn't. So he was allowed to do some practice, I guess. But I don't know. The point of all this is that I think Eddie was trying to either implicate other guys, or he was trying to sort of spread the blame a little bit. But either way, he does not admit to the stabbing, but he says that if he had stabbed him, he wouldn't have done anything wrong. So I think his point of view hasn't changed. It's just that the details of the story changed a little bit. And, if you look at the third article of the Geneva Convention, which lays out treatment of prisoners, I mean, that's an admission of a violation. And, I think I even say to him in the series, was it your intention to kill this guy? And he says, yeah. So I don't know what to say.
I'm frozen up on what exactly. I'm like, I think a loss for words. That's an overused phrase oftentimes, but that's what I find is I'm imagining being in the room, having that come at me at that point in the arc of time and the court case, and and all that being like, oh, now, wow, it's a Silence of the Lambs kind of moment almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that surprising because his attitude towards it has never really changed. I think from the beginning, he made it clear that he didn't care about this ISIS soldier and why should anyone? And one of the big things that they've always said is who's crying tears over a dead terrorist, right?
Sure.
So, and I think that appeals to a large community of people who feel like, yeah, he was an ISIS fighter, who cares? But that's really not the way, it is understandable on a human level that this guy was just shooting at us. I'm going to kill this guy. That's understandable. But the thing is, that's why they have training to abide by the rules of warfare that are laid out for very good reasons.
I can certainly relate to the frustration of something like that eating your life and sort of becoming the thing that at the same time you want to talk about. Well, you want to talk about it at the same time you want it to be done. You want to put it behind. And so I commend you there on what I know had to have been some very good relationship building work and some credibility building work in those interactions, to not to convince them to do something they didn't want to do, but to build the trust and the credibility that would allow them to feel comfortable speaking in what I know is a very difficult spot. The thread comes up throughout the series about the folks who took the risk of raising their hand were dismissed or were told to be quiet or were, they just received pushback. And it took, I'm going to throw the word courage out there I think a tremendous amount of that in knowing that community myself, not claiming to be a SEAL. My work within the SOF community was in the public affairs side, but knowing that community, being part of it, at least as a sometimes welcome guest for a couple of years, it is tight. And the idea, the rift that would have come, the difficulty of deciding I'm going to raise my hand and speak out on this one, they had to know what was coming. And that gets me to a little, I try to drive towards question. I guess the language has been used, sort of the Gallagher effect on, and I don't know that means the same thing within whistleblowing psychology as it might. It's sort of specific to Eddie Gallagher and the influence that he and his wife had on things. But there's an effect when you choose to raise your hand, then you do put yourself at risk. You do become the target, and often things will be said about you that you can't respond to. What are your thoughts on that? Hopefully I'm not catching you off guard by the Gallagher effect. What are your thoughts on that and the implications for potentially other whistleblowers or the military justice system itself, or wherever else you might want to take that line of thought?
Well, I think that's, that one of the big things about how the case played out is important, because I think, one of Paul Soldra, the reporter from Task and Purpose, he says at the end of the series, he says, the young guys coming into the SEAL pipeline or into any branch of the service now are going to see this case as an example of where some guys stuck their neck out, try to report something that was wrong. And what happened was they essentially got bullied by the community. They took a lot of heat. Their families were threatened in some cases. They lost their anonymity. Their faces were plastered on social media. They were called mean girls. And then Gallagher was not convicted. So it seemed like a loss, right? And that's going to have an effect on any young person coming into the service when they see how these guys were treated for coming forward. What's the benefit then if you put yourself out there, subject yourself to possible abuse or threats, and then nothing is going to happen anyway? It seems like it's going to have a dampening effect on the possibility of other young whistleblowers coming forward, which, that's really a shame.
It does seem that in the grand arc of all of this, it was the people who raised the flags that paid the prices. Not that the Gallagher's lives weren't also disrupted, and they paid a price. I guess you can get into some equivalency games there of who should have paid for what. But yeah, the arc of dare to raise your hand and have it lopped off is sobering.
Yeah. But I should also mention that not all of these guys left the Navy because of this. Some of these guys are still active duty and are doing very well. Some are instructors. One is in SEAL Team 6 now. So it's not that there was fallout in terms of their careers for all of them, but I think definitely it has been weighing over them for a long time. And I felt that from all of them as we were making this film, which, was definitely, once people give you that kind of trust, you carry that great responsibility, as a journalist or filmmaker, to make sure everybody receives an accurate and honest portrayal. So that was really the challenge, was how to balance this story.
That is when we let slip the proverbial dogs of war, we really are sending people into circumstances where even with training, we're asking the inhuman of them. The turn it on, turn it off, make clear decisions in an unclear environment. It's all so incredibly complex, which brings me back to affirming once again the just incredible job you did laying this story out and breaking it down into pieces that could be processed and taking such a complex thing and laying it out for folks to understand. At some point we bring a presidential pardon, I guess, into the question. And it's hard to have the conversation without, then it immediately becomes political. My intent is not to take it into politics, but in terms of, I speak for me I was retired at the time this was going on. So I was watching, and where I found out what I had to trust was the system in place. I had to trust my personal knowledge, having been on a court-martial board several times and several administrative separation boards. So I can empathize with what those people are going through. That's the jury of the peers. And I had to trust that if they made the decision that, based on seeing more evidence that I could possibly see, that for me to keep my own sense of ethics and confidence in the system itself, that's where I had to go to trust. So I had to trust that a court-martial board or jury was making the best decision they could with the information they had, and that their ruling was what it was. And then to see that waved away by a president without what to me personally was a sufficient explanation of why. But what was your sense in talking with the various people you interviewed, and as you come away with that, so what is, I guess in a sense, the damage done to trust in the system? We've hinted at a lot, like, do you raise your hand? And if you do, and you're told shut up, then those things come. Not everybody is pristine. So that's part of the problem. The whistleblowing concept is a lot of the fear is that if I blow the whistle, well, I'm not pristine. Do I have to be pristine in order to wave a flag? I don't know where the question is in there, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that influence on the system and the trust of the system from this case.
Yeah, I think what you brought up the question of the pardons, and I know that around that time, when the lead up to this trial, Trump had a real fascination with guys who were in prison for war crimes, and that I think largely was, I don't know if it came from there, but it was largely stoked by people like Sean Hannity, who actually asked the president to pardon these guys. There was Matt Goldstein, who was the Green Beret, who I think was charged with executing an Afghan guy who was suspected of being a bomb maker, and then Clint Lawrence, who had served 6 years, I think, for ordering his men to fire on civilians. And it was clear that Trump was going to pardon those guys. And I do think that Gallagher went into his trial knowing that he had a pardon in his pocket. Trump was just kind of waiting to see what happened. And he did intervene to get Eddie out of pretrial confinement. And then again, after the verdict, he intervened to reverse the demotion for Eddie, which he would have lost his pension and everything. And then he intervened again to keep the SEALs from taking away his trident. And that resulted in Richard Spencer being fired also. And I think Richard Spencer says that, the damage done by a president just intervening in this system is huge, because then, like you said, you watch all of this work being done to try to make sure that we're doing all of the right things, and then someone can come in and just undo it. That's what happened. And I think the after effects of that is this question of the pardon. I have to make it clear that everyone thinks that Eddie Gallagher was pardoned, and he wasn't. He was acquitted of everything except for taking this photo. But I do think he would have been pardoned if he had been convicted, because they had Trump's ear for sure.
I was digging into this, even articles that come up under the search of did Trump pardon Gallagher, use pardon and clemency interchangeably. It's very difficult to get into what was the actual allowance. And certainly there are distinctions. Clemency from the punitive outcome is different than pardon of the crime itself and all of those. But what we have ultimately is those several examples that you cited of a commander-in-chief stepping in multiple occasions and just sort of saying, nope.
Sorry, one thing that you brought up that I just remembered, when you were talking about the effect of this, and I think it's not just the pardons, but the general build up to that on, let's say, on Fox News. I know that a lot of these guys, they watched Fox News. Most of them voted for Trump, I think. And they all kind of described a real feeling of shock, I think, because all of a sudden on the news, you had this channel that purports to support the troops and be very pro-military, suddenly basically denouncing an entire platoon of guys in the defense of one guy who was accused of committing a war crime. And this happened again, with the Clint Lawrence case too. And I think suddenly these guys find themselves being called cowards, and they don't understand, how can you level those kinds of accusations at 10, 14 military guys and say you're pro-military to defend this one guy. And that really, I think, had an effect on several of them.
Those are the kinds of behaviors that contribute to the fear of raising a hand, and that very much muddy the waters. Case study or scenario type, sit down, let's have ethics class, talk it through and go, it's black and white, it's what I would do. You're like, nope, you wouldn't. You wouldn't do that because you're concerned about the system not supporting you. You're concerned about being accused of being a problem yourself. I see, and I will editorialize here on this, I see that from this, and having spoken with colleagues, not just I think, feel, believe, but having spoken with colleagues about it, definitely had some concerns that it undermined the system overall. There will be ramifications of that. It will be felt for years to come.
Doug, you've been very generous with your time, and this has been a great conversation. I got probably two last questions here, but before I launch into them, I do want to respond to what you shared here with Cliff about the pardons, that part of our conversation. And one thing that I thought was very evident with our previous president, Donald Trump, was his outlook on, not necessarily, I don't even know if you'd call it life or politics, but in general, he has been on the record several times about the paramount importance of simply winning, whether it's in business, whether it's in politics or whether it's in war. And, you mentioned that he had this obsession with these soldiers accused of committing crimes. In his mind, the only inexcusable thing in life is losing. And the more you can do to win, whatever that might be in the way of a method, is valid. And that sort of extends to all the pressure that was exerted on this country in the wake of our last presidential elections to try and keep him in power. And so I think that philosophical outlook extended to these soldiers. He couldn't understand why our justice system would try to hold them account for trying to win in war, as it were. And it's a very sort of grim way to look at it. But I kind of was able to trace that ideological thread with his obsession with these war crime cases and how it is sort of reflected upon his own sort of self and outlook on life.
I think why is it's powerful.
I think that's right.
You're citing, I mean, it's documented. This isn't just like, I don't like a guy, or I do like a guy. It's, as you said, the documented record of, statements of thought and the words deeds alignment consistent across the board. That was definitely a pattern in play.
For sure. And also, I mean, we are in a period now where people are afraid to criticize the actions of the military for fear that their own patriotism or loyalty to this country is going to be called into question. And I think that's very, very dangerous, especially, I mean, if you look, we're in a very interesting time to be talking about war crimes, considering what's happening in Ukraine right now. So it's just one of those things where we cannot allow ourselves to get into a situation where we can't criticize the actions of the military, where almost the vast majority of our tax money goes. So anyway, but I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's a really good point. And I think it goes back to our ability as Americans to question the powerful. And that does extend to civilian oversight over our military. Two last questions here.
Can I just say one thing about that? What you're just describing, this point of view of like winning. You're very right. That permeates its way all the way through, not just those politics, but also the story, in the sense that the people who align with this Gallagher idea of who cares if this guy is an ISIS terrorist, we're just there to win. It's always framed in these terms of good versus evil. This is a righteous crusade. This is black and white. It's good and evil. And that, it's easy to understand that when you look at things that way. However, one of the reasons why I thought it was so important for us to find this family of this guy and tell this story of who this person was because we never get that other point of view. And also, it's oddly, this ISIS mentality is exactly the same. It's good versus evil. It's the righteous crusade. It just happens to be reversed, right? And then when you actually look at the reality of who this guy was, this 17-year-old kid who was recruited off the soccer field and brainwashed essentially, and put a gun in his hand, and he wanted to quit and they wouldn't let him quit, and because he was afraid they'd kill him. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I'm not saying that he wasn't an enemy combatant, but we weren't doing it to try to generate sympathy for ISIS by any means. It's just to show how complicated these things are and how, those families are destroyed, because that's a story that played out all over the country. These young kids just recruited off the soccer field. And it sort of makes it a lot more difficult to just look at things in terms of black versus white. And then the other thing is, of course, for years and years, we've always seen movies and TV shows about these wars playing out in foreign lands, but they're always framed as kind of an American tragedy, like what's happening to our soldiers in Vietnam, what happened to our soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan. But we never actually see what happens to the actual people who live there that are truly suffering the brunt of these wars. And so anyway, for us, that was another really important reason to try to at least figure out who this was and how this situation came to be.
Doug, you actually read my mind. That was going to be my question. I was watching your series, and as I hit episode 4, the last thing that I expected as a viewer was to actually go back to Mosul years after it was retaken in this search to find out the identity of this captive and the circumstances around why he ended up there with Eddie Gallagher and the rest of the platoon. That took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting it. What was the work involved in getting to that part of the story? And did you go to Iraq for a component of that?
So we were looking for this family, and in conjunction with, we were working with somebody who sharing resources actually with a reporter from NPR who was also looking for this family. And I think I got the call that they had found him, I think maybe, I wouldn't say, it was August of not last year, the year before. And then pretty quickly, Jane from NPR, they went out to meet with the family. She recorded an interview with him. But for us, we were getting insurance together, trying to get the shoot together. And then COVID hit Iraq really hard and they shut down travel. So basically there was kind of 8-month period where we couldn't shoot. And during that time, we were trying to figure out like what are the alternatives, and we ended up with a really great crew on the ground, and I wanted to go, but right before we were supposed to go, there were a couple of bombings in Baghdad, which was very unusual. And due to security concerns, in the end, it was basically determined that we have to just use a local crew, unfortunately. But they did an incredible job, and I will say that during that period, there was another family that was identified and they had the same story and they believed that this was their son. Similar situation, the kid recruited from the soccer field, came home, the dad tried to chain him up and keep him from going back out, but the kid broke out and they believed that this was his son. But we actually filmed with both of these families, and in the end, our intelligence sources on the ground there and the people on the ground who talked to both of them felt like this was most likely the family featured in the series is most likely the family. But we had to put a disclaimer there because there is another family who believes this, and there might be more because it's a very common story there. Anyway, that's all to say that, yeah, we had an incredible local crew who not only found the family, but actually found these towers that Alpha Platoon used as their sniper positions and found the graffiti that we had heard about, written about Eddie on the walls. And I mean, they really did an incredible job.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering about that component of your film, how you were able to get those incredible aerial drones over Mosul in the aftermath of the battle to take it. And it's sobering to think that years onwards, Mosul's still smashed, completely smashed. And once again, I thought it was a point to your series that you took the effort to find this sort of Iraqi voice within it somehow. And that it was not only an exclusively sort of American trauma or experience. And I applaud your local team for helping achieve that.
Yeah,
my last question. Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say it was hard to figure out where to fit it because it was such an outlier. But I think I felt like in the end we figured it out.
It's a cliche to say, but it's such a dehumanizing activity. And right or wrong, understanding the gray or not, the humanity was taken away from that lad, and you gave it back in the end of that series. Thank you for that.
Well, sure. I'll just also say that his family, Jamal, his father, they live in a town that's basically, it's not a prison town, but they are not allowed to leave it. Almost every family in this town had a family member, at least one family member who was part of ISIS. So they are essentially, there's army postings all around the town. And so it's something that affected huge number of people. And I'm sure a lot of them still have sympathies that lie with ISIS. I don't know. This family seemed to have been kind of, torn apart by this, which is just interesting background to understand fully the scope of the story.
Doug, I guess another question your series ultimately raises is whether there can be any justice in war. Eddie Gallagher was accused of murdering one captive, but the violence we brought to Iraq and Afghanistan stretches back almost 2 decades, and few U.S. or allied forces have faced consequences for alleged war crimes in theater. For additional context, and I'm quoting here from a New York Times article where this is drawn from, a drone unit called Talon Anvil is thought to have circumvented rules imposed to protect non-combatants in Syria. And people involved with them within the military, including the CIA, suspect that they were involved in killing numerous non-combatants, including farmers trying to harvest, children in the street, families fleeing fighting, and villagers sheltering in buildings. And to my knowledge, no one from Talon Anvil has been held to account for these alleged war crimes. When you frame the trial of Eddie Gallagher against stories like this, why should the death of one battlefield captive matter to us as Americans?
I mean, I think that's a good question. First of all, I just want to make a small correction there. So Eddie was actually accused of killing this combatant, but also of shooting civilians, right? He was acquitted of those charges, but those were the accusations. And because there was photographic evidence and video from this detainee situation, that kind of became the center of the trial, because there was no evidence other than witness reports for the shootings. So when the focus comes down to this Iraqi ISIS fighter, I think that people have to confront their own ambivalence about this. And, that was true for me as well. I remember thinking, okay, if he killed this ISIS soldier who was just shooting at them an hour before, does that really matter? And I think a lot of people would say no. I think plenty of people think he did this and don't care, including guys on the platoon. But like we were talking about before, we have the Geneva Conventions for a reason. We have the International Criminal Court for a reason. And those lay out very specific rules for the treatment of people who have laid down their arms, who are in your custody, who are wounded, and who are unarmed. And if, ISIS, they don't care about those rules. They don't abide by those rules. So, these rules were created during a time before we had faceless enemies, nationless enemies like this, I think. So if you're going to go to war against an enemy that doesn't abide by these rules, should we still play by the rules? I think we have to, because if we don't and we lose that, it's hard to say that we have moral authority right now, but if you lose that, if you don't even have the pretense of following these rules, then you lose everything. Then who's going to ever listen to us again? And who's going to say that they won't torture or maim our prisoners of war? And it does feel like a really weird time to be talking about this, because, I'm pretty sure there are war crimes being committed every day right now in Ukraine. Is anyone going to ever be held to account for those? It seems unlikely, but it doesn't mean that we need to give up on trying to establish some very basic rules for humanity here. And so, to answer your question, in the scheme of things, this is a very small infraction, I would say, compared to the drone strike in Baghuz, Syria, that I think killed 80 women and children and was covered up for the last 2 years. But it still is a case where people came forward to say this is wrong, and they did that for a good reason. And, on top of that, there were Iraqi ERD soldiers there with cell phones recording this. I don't know where those recordings are, but trust me, we tried to find them. And if they have a US sailor stabbing a prisoner, imagine the propaganda that they could use that for. See, the Americans are doing exactly what we said, coming in and slaughtering our innocents, our children, our prisoners, So there are a lot of reasons, not just because it's the right thing to do, but there are also practical reasons why we have to abide by these rules. And I think that's why it matters. And also because what we talked about before, the signal it sends to the next generation of men and women coming into the forces and letting them know that, yeah, you need to raise your hand if you see something wrong. We have to hold ourselves accountable. For me, that's why it matters.
Well, it didn't take me much thinking as watching through the line to get that theme across, to understand, without it just being jammed right at us, that is the heart of this thought, is putting that humanity back into this. It's an easy out final question I'm just personally fond of putting on the table for folks. And that is, what's the question you wish we had asked? Or is there anything that you want to say that we haven't given you an opportunity to say? And if the answer to that is, I'm good, then that's fair as well. But that's our final question for you, is what did we miss? What do you wish we had asked, or wish that we had given you an opportunity to share, Doug?
Yeah, I don't think we've really missed anything big. I would just say, I'm glad that you guys responded so well to the series. And as difficult and complicated as it was, I mean, for me, it turned out to be just an extreme pleasure to be able to sit and hear from guys like this for such long periods of time, including the Gallaghers and the guys on the team. It was just a really fascinating insight into a world that we never get to see. And on top of the case and trial and everything, I hope that feeling of getting a special, behind the scenes tour of what it's like to be a Navy SEAL and what we're doing over there, I hope that comes through.
It did indeed. You did a masterful job, you and your crew, of, as I said, pulling such a complicated issue together into a narrative arc that can help make some sense of it. Now, thank you for that. And thank you for your time.
Appreciate that.
And that, put the mic back to Wise to Wrap. And those are my last words.
Thanks, Cliff.
Doug, our country has been a work of progress for 200 years. And every, age that we are given as an opportunity to be better as a people and as a nation. And certainly the line of progress has not been straight. And part of that is acknowledging where we were wrong or where we could have done better. And your film, I think, is going to serve as an important part of our understanding of the war on terror, the last 2 decades of our military involvement overseas, where we've had hundreds of thousands of men and women serve dutifully and honorably within our armed services. And at the same time, it's an important admission that we may have been able to do better and we may have done wrong in our prosecution of these wars, and to help us understand how we could put those safeguards in place that could prevent an accusation like this or a situation like this from arising again, in this way of supporting whistleblowers within the military and providing them the means to report wrongdoing more effectively. So I would like to thank you and everyone involved in the line, and I would encourage everyone who's listened to this interview to seek it out on Apple TV Plus, along with the accompanying podcast. I think this is an important story and one that we should not forget about moving forward.